I'd just like to introduce Dr. Olivia Hurley from IADT. She's a sports psychologist. I'm delighted to have her here. I'm really looking forward to her talk. I'm sure everyone will take a lot away from it. So just a warm welcome to Dr. Olivia Hurley.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Now, I'm going to be one of those really horrible people, and I'm going to put this back on, but I'll keep it off just for a moment, just for the purposes of, I think, pictures and video or something that people want to take, which is fine. You can do it now for the first 5 minutes, if that's okay. So I've been instructed as well. I'm a former sprinter. 2 things. First of all, I ran for Ireland, but I could talk for Ireland, so I was told to keep it brief. And the other thing is that I was told I like to be a moving target, and I was told I'm not supposed to move from the podium because I can't move away from the mic, which is also not what I'm used to. So added to all of that, as I say, joking aside, thank you so much for the lovely invitation from Colm and the team here at DCU to come and speak to you today. I suppose one of the first things I'd like to say is, the title of my talk, Colm again and the team said you've got free rein, you can talk really about whatever you like, which is never a good thing, because you always prefer to be instructed as to what you should really be speaking on. And I know Hannah and other speakers are coming after me and have been on before, and they've been brilliant, so no pressure whatsoever. So I suppose I came up with this title because I wanted to give you a little bit of background to so interested, and I suppose jumped at the chance to speak when Colm invited me as part of the team to come along today and help with the launch. I think it's a really great study, really great project. I think it's really valuable. It's going to be worth a lot, I think, moving forward within the whole context of sport in Ireland and many things. I think I probably came on Colm's radar because I've done recently some podcasts and various things, particularly dealing with the likes of referees. And we know that they've been open to quite a lot of abuse and quite a lot of negativity in recent times. In fact, they were even, they were out on strike at one point, and rightly so, for various kind of reasons. So I think it's really timely that this project is starting, and no better to lead it than here in DCU with their sport kind of affiliations and background. So I chose this title to have fun and thrive, not just survive, and then creating what I consider to be one of the things that I'm really passionate about. As a sports psychologist, I work with loads of athletes and loads of different teams and different people involved within organised sport. And it is about trying to create what we call these challenging but supportive environments, okay? So the first thing I want to just ask you all is, I'm sure you're obviously, you've taken part in sport, or you are sports people yourselves, or you're involved in organisations, or whatever it might be. Ultimately, why did you get into sport? Anybody? Be brave, brave action.
Just to have a bit of fun.
Exactly. Who am I speaking to there?
It's
Maggie. Exactly. To have fun. Okay? And I always tell the athletes that I work with, whether they're at novice, intermediate or elite level, if you're not having fun, why are you doing it? So that's why something like bullying in sport is such a big deal, is that we don't want our children and our teenagers and our adults seeing sport as a chore or seeing it as something that they're just trying to survive as opposed to thriving and having fun in. Okay? So, is it okay if I put the mask on now? Is that okay? Now, you'll hear me fine, don't worry. I am well used to projecting my voice. Can everybody still hear me okay? Yeah, see. Perfect. Okay, so just to say as well that if anybody wants to contact me after today, some of the research papers that I'm going to just refer to, they are available to you. I've chosen 2 that are based around kind of, open access. They're not like, subscription journal papers, so you don't have to pay for them. But if anybody has any interest after today and wants to contact me, my social media and my email address is there, and it'll be on the last slide as well. And please feel free to drop me a line if there's anything that I can do to help and support any of you in your various sport organisations, okay? So what am I going to do today? I'm going to talk, I know the grey background is a little bit, I kind of went away from the white because it kind of was too bright. And I said that'll blind them. So I kind of toned it down, but if it's a little dark, my apologies. So what I want to talk about today, any good lecturer will tell you that you should always set out some objectives when it comes to your particular presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of base it around kind of 4 key things. And first of all are 5 key things to define what is bullying. Okay, now I'm sure many of you know what bullying is, and you've probably already have definitions of that from earlier today. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about what are the traditional cyberbullying, which maybe has been mentioned, but maybe not. And then just one or two little things about sport-related bullying as well, okay? And then I'm going to just mention just two, because I don't want to make it too academic, two studies that have been done very recently, one from Spain and one from Lithuania, actually. Nice to include a study like that, considering what's going on in the world, and from that part of the world, they're doing really good research. And they've done two really good studies, one based around athletes and one based around coaches. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Then I just want to distinguish between the different types of environments within sport, okay? And they're the ones that we as sports psychologists would be having identified, then would be saying there's kind of one that's a gold standard, which I would be saying for the project and for everybody here today, it's the kind of sport environment you should be encouraging your organisations to develop, okay? And then when I explain which one that is as the gold standard, I'll explain what its defining features are. So in other words, the one that is this really high challenge, high support type environment, what we call a facilitative environment, okay? And I can see there's some familiar faces in the audience who might have heard of some of these things before. And then finally, again, trying to keep within the theme of what today is all about, give you some advice on, maybe even getting ahead of Colm and his team and trying to start implementing some of the things that you think might be useful or helpful within your own organisations, and encouraging coaches and athletes and all of the people involved to try and, I suppose, aim towards developing these type of environments, okay? So, again, that might be a little bit dark, but just to say, we all know what bullying is, okay? So bullying by its very nature is, I suppose the key thing is that it's a behaviour that it's intended to harm, okay? And it comes in various formats. So we've got physical bullying, that kind of, which we're all traditionally very used to, hitting, those kind of behaviours, but also things like exclusion, which is social bullying, and then things like our other examples there, like verbal and physical, obviously name calling, things like that, okay? There is what we always should be aware of, and that is this mismatch or imbalance of power, okay? This dynamic that happens with the victim and the perpetrator, okay? So it's very important that we know that there's an aggressor and there's a victim. Now, there's one thing about the bullying literature that is actually interesting, is that we've always said that it's behaviour that occurs repeatedly. But actually now what a lot of the research is saying is that it can be bullying even if there's only one incident. And you should be able to catch that incident, and then it shouldn't escalate if you get it in time. So it shouldn't be that it's for a sustained period of time. But only one incident is enough to be able to say that is bullying and to call it out. Okay? So we need to be aware of that, because a lot of the literature and the definitions, there is no one agreed definition of bullying universally, but these are the kind of common features. But a lot of them say that it has to be repetitive over time. And now we're actually saying, no, one incident of bullying is enough. That's it. It doesn't have to be that the behaviour is continuous over time for us to label it as bullying. Okay? Now, cyberbullying is all of what I've just said, but within the cyber world. So using your iPads and phones and devices. And the difference is that it doesn't need that explicit interaction between the individuals. So that physical bullying doesn't kind of occur obviously in the cyber world, but the social bullying and the verbal kind of abuse, that's what happens. Now, just one thing I want to mention in relation to sport before I move on, and that is we need to be aware of the type of bullying that we're talking about here. So one of the things that we use as two ways of distinguishing it is horizontal and vertical bullying. So horizontal bullying is what we refer to in sport as athlete v athlete. Okay, on that same level. And then vertical is where we're talking coach-athlete, where it's top-down, okay? So we need to be aware of all the different types if we're going to try and develop something that's going to tackle all of these things, okay? So that's just a little kind of a explanation before I move on to anything else. So this is one of the first studies that I just wanted to mention to you, okay? It's a really recent study, okay? And it's available in the journal called Frontiers in Psychology. Now, if any of you are interested, if you go into Frontiers in Psychology, you just Google it. It's an open access journal, and you could get a copy of this paper. In fact, I was going to bring a few copies today and print them off, but I actually just wasn't able to get the printer working earlier on. So I said, well, I'll have to just refer to the web link, and they can actually access it themselves. So you can go in and look at this journal yourself. It's not subscription based. It's very good, it's peer reviewed, and you can always tell how well the journal article is doing, because it'll show you how many hits it's had, which is always a good, kind of indicator of how interested people are in this particular topic, okay? So this was a study that was done. It was a qualitative study, which means that they did what's called semi-structured interviews, and they interviewed just a small number of athletes in Spain, okay? Now, they weren't top elite athletes. They were kind of a mixture of intermediate and some higher level athletes, a mixture of males and females. There was more males than there were females, and it was quite a young demographic, okay? So it was kind of that early kind of, adulthood kind of age range. The aim of the study, which is obviously what we're interested in today, was that they wanted to identify what are the characteristics of bullying that these athletes were talking about, and then how did they themselves deal with the bullying that they were experiencing, and what was the consequences for them. And I know Hannah is maybe going to talk a little bit about the mental and the psychological impact that these specific type of toxic behaviours have on athletes, okay? And it's probably reflective of what maybe Hannah's going to say in terms of what this study found, okay? Because the study found, one of the most interesting ones when I looked at this was that the bullying behaviour, the location of it was really interesting. It happened in the changing room. And I've got a lovely quote that's going to emphasise that from one of the athletes, okay? So we need to be aware, where is the bullying happening? As a coach or as an administrator or as an organisational person, you often might not even see what's going on because it's kept away from you. You're not in the changing room. And yet the changing room is one of the places where people are at their most vulnerable, particularly from an athlete perspective, okay? Where you're changing and where you're kind of exposed in many ways, okay? The thing that they also noted was that the athletes, there was no kind of real definition as to who was bullied, and that we often think that the victim of bullying is somebody who is an athlete who maybe isn't as proficient in their skills. Actually, in this particular study, athletes who are very proficient and the top athletes were targeted in the same way as some of the athletes who maybe were not as kind of elite in their skill set. And that's really interesting because that means that it's kind of mixed in terms of who's the target. So there's no one definition of it'll always be this type of individual and they're the ones we need to protect. And these people will be immune to it because they're so good at their sport. Jealousy and things like that happen, and then these really top athletes can be the ones that actually get targeted as well. And that was reflective in this study. In terms of how the athletes coped with the actual bullying, what was common in this particular study was that they used, which we wouldn't like to see, which is more passive coping mechanisms. They withdrew from sport. They avoided the situation. And that's exactly what we don't want. We want to encourage active coping strategies, which is encouraging the athletes and having coaches and parents and administrators giving the same message. Seek out support, seek out help. And yet that's still something that even in this day and age, athletes are afraid to do, and they don't do. Okay? And then finally, the last two things in terms of consequences of the bullying itself in this study, first of all, psychologically, they were more, I suppose, exposed to things like feeling afraid, feeling sad, hypervigilance, in other words, always being on alert, seeking out and looking for the threats in their environment, which is not a good thing for any young adult or teenager to be exposed to and to be doing within their everyday lives, okay? So they're the kind of things that we know bullying has in terms of consequences for the athletes, okay? So this was a really interesting study, and as I said, I was going to mention just one key thing, and that's this lovely quote from one of the athletes, which I think was one of the key things that I took away from this study, and that was, we need to be aware of where the bullying is happening, and this was where it was in the changing rooms. So the changing room is an enclosed space where no one intervenes, where no one can see you, where there is no camera, where there are no rules. That can be a jungle. Now, we've just already said at the very beginning, we want our athletes to have fun and thrive in their sporting environment, not just survive it. And yet, if you see your sport environment and the changing room as a jungle, you're literally just trying to survive the experience. And that can never be enjoyable for any individual. So we need to be aware of that and also know that that's where, if you're that horizontal bullying, athlete to athlete, the coach is not present. And that is a big factor as well. So we need our coaches to be ready to intervene. Now, following up from that, the next study that I'm just going to mention was a study that was done on coaches. And it was a study done in Lithuania very recently as well, where they looked at what did the coaches say about bullying behaviour and how aware were they of these behaviours in their environment, okay? There was 8 of them, again, more males than females. It was a qualitative study as well, where they interviewed them, semi-structured interviews. And the aim was to uncover the type of environment, which is going to follow on from what I'm going to talk about in a moment, that these kind of behaviours occurred within, and where the type of environment that we can develop and encourages these types of negative behaviours, okay? Now, a couple of key interesting points about this study. One was that some of the coaches that were interviewed actually regarded these, what they considered to be mild incidences of bullying, as a way to kind of weed out the players that they didn't think were particularly, suitable for the environment. So they called it the conveyor, like a conveyor belt, the conveyor principle, where they said it was kind of a version of natural selection. In other words, they excused the behaviour, okay? Now, maybe that's a cultural thing from the study taking part in a different part of the world to Ireland, but it's still a really interesting European perspective to get on this type of behaviour. The second thing that came out from this particular study was that the coaches didn't really seem to think that it was their responsibility to deal with this bullying. And actually, this quote is very insightful. In that period up to the age of 16, parents have to bear that burden, because parents primarily must teach that they can't jeer, that they have to show a good example during the match themselves. They can't shout using swear words at opponents' children. They can't let children write on Facebook what they want and how they want. It's purely parental responsibility, because the coach's job is to train. Parents educate. And I thought that was a really insightful quote from a coach of any athlete, to think that they're not in a position of, being a good role model and being able to guide and mentor these athletes. And that, yes, it is their job to educate as well as to train. But these coaches didn't seem to think that. And that could very well be the case here within Ireland as well. Coaches will say, it's not my responsibility, parents have to take responsibility. Yes, too, but not solely, okay? So that's the academic stuff, okay? So they were just 2 studies that I just wanted to give you a quick look at, just to show you the kind of research that's been done in this area across Europe, okay? Particularly because this is a European-funded study in DCU. So what are the types of environment then? I said my talk was about creating this, what I call a really good environment, a healthy environment, this facilitative environment, okay? So there's 4 types of environment that a particular researcher that I'm just mentioning on the bottom here of the screen, if you're interested, a guy called Mustafa Sarkar, okay? Now, Sarkar is a really top researcher in the UK who's done loads of research around the area of resilience, how we develop resilience. Now, I know we're all sick of hearing the word resilience over the last 2 years, okay? You need to be resilient, okay? That's fine, we've all done that, okay? But actually, joking aside, it's a really good talent, if you like, to develop within athletes. People think resilience is a trait. It's not. It is something that can be taught. It is something that we all can develop, okay? So Mustafa Sarkar and one of his colleagues, David Fletcher, they've done loads of research over the last 10 years in this area of resilience, okay? But they've identified, through their research, 4 different types of environment that occur within sport. And what's called the gold standard. So they've identified, and I'll just explain each one. The first is what's called an unrelenting environment. And that's an environment where coaches and organisations and even athletes themselves give lots of challenge, but there's also very low support. So think of it like a tennis player, right? And you're at the receiving end of somebody's serve. And the balls are coming at you, even like, one of those machines that they chuck the balls come at you like, quick fire. Imagine that's like what's happening. You're being challenged, but you're not getting any support. That's not a healthy environment. That's what I would actually call a toxic environment with any sporting organisation, where you're giving so much challenge to your athletes and you're not giving them the required support. And it's called an unrelenting environment, okay? Another word for it is toxic environment. Now, there's 2 other ones: stagnant environment and comfortable environment. And again, they're where, for comfortable, you're given no challenge really, but lots of support. Now, sport should be a challenge. The athletes I work with, I tell them all the time, if your coach and me and your parents, if we're not setting you and helping you to kind of, set for yourself really good targets and really good performance standards, where's the excitement and fun in you just staying within your kind of, very comfortable zone? We want to challenge you, but we're also going to give you lots of support to enable you to reach those standards, okay? So comfortable environment is where you give them no challenge or very low challenge, which they're kind of capable of, but you give high support. And maybe in younger athletes, children, that's maybe where you start from. But you want to work it up towards what we consider the gold standard, which I'll get to in a minute. Stagnant environment is where you give very low challenge and there's very low support as well. And that's not really conducive to good and fun and enjoyable and challenging sporting environments, okay? So the one that Sarker and Fletcher, and Sarker particularly, Mustafa would say is the gold standard, is this what we call facilitative environment, where we give lots of challenge, but we also give lots of support, okay? So if I was to ask you, what do you think are the characteristics of this facilitative environment? What would you say? So hands up. Derek. Inclusion, very good. And I know you've had a talk earlier on about inclusion. So the phrase I would use, Derek, is that we're all in this together. We all have a place, okay? So absolutely, inclusion, and there's a voice and a place for everybody. What we call a psychologically safe zone. Sport should be a psychologically safe environment. Physically safe to the best of our ability as well, but psychologically a safe zone. Anybody else?
Authentic.
Sorry?
Authentic.
Authentic? Yes, absolutely. Very good. What else?
Recognition.
Who's?
Recognition.
Recognition, absolutely, brilliant. In other words, you celebrate the wins. You celebrate even the little wins. I had an interesting conversation with somebody after the Ireland-England game last Saturday, okay? Great result. Somebody said, oh, it was a terrible performance. I was like going, how many times have England beaten Ireland under exactly the same conditions? Do you think that they thought that wasn't a great win? Absolutely. Johnny Sexton gave an interview on Off the Ball on, I think, Saturday evening. It's on Off the Ball if you want to go in and have a look on Instagram. And he said, that was a game 2 years ago we would have lost. And he said, the next line, which as a sports psychologist I loved, the mental skills training that we've been doing over the last 18 months really stood to us. And he then went on to allude as to what that was. So it was brilliant that he was actually commenting on their mental skills training, okay? So you celebrate the wins and you recognise the successes. And that should be something that we definitely do. You don't wait till the end of a career or until the end of a season to then say, why would young people want to take part in sport if they're not having those little enjoyable kind of moments along the way? They're the ones that help armour them against the ones that don't go so well. Anybody else?
Well, Andy Hughes, my name from Sport Against Racism. I deal with young people, particularly coming from diverse ethnic minority backgrounds. So there's particular skills involved in developing cultural confidence to deal with different religions, different languages.
Sure.
And building up the resilience like we talked about earlier on. The cycle that's fine because the duty of care that the coach must have, dealing with these kids.
Great, okay. Anybody else? Any other key characteristics that you think define this facilitative environment? Yeah? Empower them, absolutely. Love it. I don't need to put up the next lot of points. You're getting every single one of them. In other words, letting them have what we call a say in what goes on. So the way we say to athletes and coaches now, give the players ownership. Allow them to be part of that decision-making process around the targets that are set for the team and so on. Really good. Anybody else? I'd say I needn't put up all the points because you're getting all of them.
Opportunities for growth.
Very good, yes, absolutely. Encouraging, and in other words, getting them to crave feedback and to seek out how to be better. Brilliant.
Demanding, pushing, demanding.
Yeah, absolutely. We should never shy away from the fact that we should challenge, but we challenge in a way that is kind and in a way that is encouraging. My mentor, Professor Aidan Moran, who, as I'm sure some of you may have heard, he's literally just coming up to his 2-year anniversary, and I called him my academic dad, and I literally would not be standing here today without Aidan's mentorship. And I don't think I've ever given a talk since he passed away 2 years ago, and his anniversary is actually just coming up this week, the 16th, okay? Without mentioning him, okay? And he used to always say, high challenge, high support. You know, it's always that we should be doing those things. But we should be encouraging challenge. Don't ever shy away from that. It is something that we should all do. Okay, so I think I'm just going to put up all of the different ones here, okay? And let's see if you got pretty much, I think, all of them. So what would Mustafa Sarkar say is the gold standard and the key characteristics? The first one is set those challenging goals. The individuals have input, they are allowed to take ownership of the process, and they want to seek out those challenges to help with their development, which somebody mentioned, and crave feedback. And I was just going to mention as well what Professor Aidan Moran used to say. He'd say if you're going to give feedback, and this is a little coaching tip, if an athlete has done something really well, I'm an academic, so I, as well as doing applied work, I also am a lecturer. So I have to give students feedback on their assignments, okay? And a little trick that Aidan always had was he used to say, and he was a very kind individual, if anybody ever met him, he really was that kind of an individual. And he'd say, the best feedback is the one that if you give positive feedback to somebody, for example, in a match, let's say, and you say, you did this really well, and you did this really well, and your passing was great, and you know that the athlete's maybe tackling wasn't up to maybe par that day, and you'd like them to improve on that. His little trick was, you say all of the good things, and if you say the word but, the shutters come up. So you did this really well, your passing was great, your kicking was great, but you need to work on your tackling. All the athlete hears is, shutters up, tackling was terrible. And Aidan's trick was, your passing was great, your tackling was great, and if we work on, this little element, you'll be off the charts. Simple change of the word but to and. And now the athlete is still listening to you and is craving that feedback from you. So that's a really small little trick, but it's something that it worked every time he ever gave me feedback on anything that I wrote. You did this well, and let's work on this little thing. And that meant that you were literally leaning in going, give me more, I want more feedback. And athletes, by their very nature, feedback is something that they tend to be a little bit uncomfortable with, because they sometimes take it as a bit of a personal criticism. So we need to kind of bring them with us, okay? So giving it in a way that's just positive and conducive to keeping them with you. Simple little tricks to do that. Good relationships between coaches and leaders and athletes, okay? We need to make sure that those relationships and open communication happens, okay? That psychologically safe zone, which encourages that high challenge, sensible risk taking. Do you know when athletes and young people are at their most vulnerable when it comes to risk taking? Anybody? If I said to you, what is the age range where young people take the most risks? Could you give me the age bracket that the psychology research would support? And actually, any of you who are parents, I'm afraid their brains are hardwired to do this, so you can't stop it. You have to just help to guide them through it. It's your teenage years. It's from the ages of 13 to 19. And you know where we say to young people, they'll get into a car and drive fast and have a crash, or they'll go out swimming, out of their depth. They do what we consider, and often is the phrase, why are you being so stupid? I have news for you. They're not stupid at all. Their cognitive ability and their assessment of risk is just the same as yours. But they have a system. I'll give you an example. It's called it's like a cognitive system and a brake. It's like a car. Think of it like that. In the teenage years, the way the brain and the body develops, it's like we put them into a car and we give them the accelerator and we don't give them the brake. There's what's called an incentivized processing system, that they want to keep putting their foot on that accelerator, but we haven't given them the brake. And the brake doesn't develop in your brain. Evolution has to be, is the reason as the answer for that. Doesn't develop until into your 20s and 30s. So when you say to a young person, they only got sense, they are biologically hardwired to have this incentivized risk-taking, but no brake. The brake kind of comes along afterwards. So they're at their most vulnerable, ironically, during the time where we want them to stay in sport and where we want them to be engaged in what we call healthy risk-taking. Sport is a healthy risk-taking activity. High challenge, and it gives them that buzz that maybe going out and drinking or taking drugs or driving fast in a car will, if you like, it substitutes for that. So that's why we want them taking part in sport. But many of them, they drop out of sport because they find the buzz from these other activities is bigger. So we kind of want it to be that sport continues to be fun and gives them a buzz, because we want them to stay in it, because it is the one that can give them a healthy risk-taking avenue. Okay? So, healthy risk-taking and healthy competition. John Kramer, one of my other colleagues up the north, said, never be afraid to throw in a little bit of argy-bargy and a bit of conflict and healthy competition within a team. We always think that things like, any kind of, arguments or conflict is bad for a team. It's not if it's done in the right way. But it needs to be monitored, it needs to be done in a way that it is healthy competition and healthy, that little bit of conflict and little bit of niggle that goes on, but not where it's abusive and not where it gets out of hand. Okay? So it doesn't always have to be happy in the sporting environment. Healthy competition is good. It keeps standards high and keeps people wanting to go back for more. It keeps it exciting. Everybody supports each other. And I love this phrase, and it goes back to one of the things that Derek, I think the first one, learning from each other's mistakes, encouraging those little wins to be celebrated, and a sense of we're all in this together. They are the features of this facilitative environment. High challenge, high support, and where bullying tends not to happen, because it's not tolerated, because these features are all what characterises this environment. Okay? So, as I said, I could talk for Ireland, but I'm going to finish up on these couple of little bits of advice, okay? So how do you create this desirable, gold standard facilitative environment, okay? High challenge, don't shy away from that, no need, but also high support. We need what's called a multi-level approach. We need, unlike the coach's quote, we need our coaches, our policymakers, our teachers, our parents, everybody involved in what's going on. We also need to have really good role models. We need to give our young people examples of what is the behaviours that are to be encouraged and what is not to be tolerated. Okay? And that's where I would say that will be the challenge for this particular research team going forward, to identify what are those, role models and gold standard kind of, environments that we can all in Ireland move towards developing here. We need policy change. Okay? We need it to be that bullying at any level, whether it's at athlete to athlete level, coach to athlete level, or being, I suppose, perpetrated against our officials, that it is not tolerated and that it needs to be kind of, if you like, kind of weeded out. And that will involve many, many levels, but it is often more difficult at an organisational or a general sport level. It's easier at individual and team level, but it shouldn't be left to individuals and teams. It should be that it's at an organisation level and at a national level. We need national campaigns, like the wonderful campaign that Hannah's been involved in with Tackle My Feelings and things like that, okay? So we need a similar one that's going to look at bullying in that kind of way, where people know this is what is acceptable behaviour, these are the kind of environments we want to create, and these are not the other kind that we want to create. But we need to educate people on that.
Sorry.
Sure.
Would you agree that the transitional periods of trying to weed out that environment can lead to lack of success, that the boys tend to win in that, where you're trying to implement that culture?
Yeah. I suppose there's no really definitive right answer to that. I think we need to be ready for that being a possibility. But I still think that you can still, if you look at what the facilitative environment is, it's still full of high challenge. So it isn't that it's not that we're lowering standards. We need to be careful about how we view that. So it isn't that we're asking people to perform at a lower level or to reduce their level of competitiveness. It's just that we're actually calling out unacceptable behaviours. And it really is that two things that I always encourage people within this environment is, and there was a study done by Google actually it was their covert, it was called Project Aristotle. It was their quest to find the perfect team, okay? And what they actually found out through their research was that really good high-performing teams, that I would say really did encapsulate this facilitative environment, they had two really good characteristics among those team members. And they were, number one, conversational turn-taking, And the second thing was that the people in the team, and this is why these are always a bit difficult and have been for young people and children, there's a test we call reading the mind through the eyes, okay? In other words, being what's called socially sensitive. In other words, if somebody walks into your changing room and it's a teammate, you should know by their demeanour, their body language, their facial expression, whether they're having a good day or not. And actually, really good functioning teams are ones where people actually invest in the individuals and get to know each other as individuals and care about each other. I say talk, TLC, talk, listen, and care about your team and your team members, okay? So I don't really think that it will be a requirement for us to lower our standards. It's just to make people more socially aware and more aware of these kind of environments that are the gold standards that can be created and give them good examples of where they do currently exist, okay? But I do think that it is a case of it is over to the researchers now, here particularly within DCU, to try to tease out what is the best way to communicate all of this information. So that's really all I wanted to say. As Aidan would always say, recap, make sure that they know what they're going away with. So hopefully you've got a better understanding of some of the research that's currently being done within this area. You have a better understanding of the type of environment that is that gold standard that we're trying to create, full of high challenge, but also high support, this facilitative environment. And that ultimately, you know, we kind of know how we might go about doing that. But as I said, it's over to the DCU team, which I'm sure will make a wonderful job of their new research in trying to develop a strategy and policy change going forward for to help all of this to actually happen actively on the ground. So that it's not just something that we, how to say, kind of speak about, but is actually put into practice and is a real, what I call, brave action. That it's actually put into place and it's action-based, applied, rather than just something that gets left on a shelf as a policy document. So listen, thanks so much to everybody for listening today. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. So has anybody got any questions? I've no idea how I'm doing on time. I'm assuming somebody would have talked. I'm spot on, pretty much. Great. I told you she could talk for Ireland, so I could have kept going, but I know Hannah has a brilliant presentation coming up. Anybody got any questions? Thanks a million for your contributions, by the way. I love where people get a little bit involved. Yeah?
Thank you very much. Lecture on various sport and coaching. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed your presentation today. Legend. And the question I have for you is that I really like when you put up your points that the word individual came out. Sometimes we talk about they or them, where I think it's actually very much individual. Have you any tips of how volunteer coach working with a group of 15 or 20 youngsters can help to identify the individual needs within the group, so it becomes less they and them and you're working with them?
That's a really great point, okay? I'm sure you've heard the cliche, there's no I in team, but I would say, but there's a me. So we often forget the fact that a team, yes, it's a collective, but it is made up of a number of individuals. I think one of the best tips is that if you really want your team to perform really well, okay, it's identifying and recognising that they all are individuals and they all bring different strengths and benefits to the team. Athletes love where they think that you are invested in them more than just as being an athlete. So if you really want to bring your team along, the individuals, you have to get to know them. You have to be that kind of real role model and mentor where they feel comfortable coming and talking to you. That can mean that things like, you know, we often talk in sports psychology about team building and kind of days out and having a bit of fun. But I think giving athletes the space to be able to talk to the coach, but also talk to each other and getting to know each other as more than just Mary who plays corner back or Johnny who plays scrum half, okay? They need to know, you know, things like where are they studying? What are their hobbies? What do they like to do when they have fun outside of sport? Because that means that then when they walk in that door on the day that you know, looking at their face, they're not having a good day, that they'll be more comfortable saying to you, well, actually, the reason why I'm a bit distracted today or I look the way I do is because I didn't sleep last night because I had a row with my mum and this is happening in my family or whatever. So they're more comfortable opening up to you about the stuff that what I consider to be that, you know, the holistic athlete is at the centre, athlete-centred approach. but where everything around the athlete, all of their personal factors and their situational factors, they bring that into every training session. They bring that into every game. Now, my job as a sports psychologist is to try to help them to not let that kind of distract them too much, but we also need to be aware that they're human and they will lose focus, and how to get them to refocus. So I think that is one of the best tips that I could give, is that you've got to get to know your individuals as people before they're your player. And that often works. Thanks a million. Derek, one last question.
So both yourself and Zach, to varying degrees, mentioned some of the elements of the work at the moment is accreditation and Ukraine. And it's also sparked online conversation about what athletes can and cannot say on, about like politics, about their views on this. Can you comment a bit about the power that they have and what the consequences are if they do use that power and things like that? It's a bit of a topic at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, Derek, because there's many sporting organisations, even in Ireland, at a very top level, where the athletes are encouraged to stick to the party line. They don't deviate from that. And that's where I would actually have, it's difficult, because at the same time as you saying you stick to the party line, and they will say, well, we want to speak out, but we are not in a position to, because we're not supposed to have a political view, or it could damage like athletes ultimately, they know that if they do something that it could impact their careers, particularly at elite level. So, they can be fined if they are found to, bring the organisation into disrepute. I think there's a way that the athletes themselves can come forward as a collective. It's more difficult for an organisation to vilify a group than it is to vilify an individual. So I think if the athletes could come together and have a collective stand and have a collective way of speaking about what they are, concerned about in terms of what's happening in the world, that would then be viewed, I think, more favourably by the upper management of the organisation. And I think as a group, there's protection in that as well. I think it's really hard for them as individuals. While we'd love them to speak out individually, I think that's a big ask in certain contexts, obviously at the more elite level, where it's their careers and their jobs are on the line. I don't think we should, we have to remember where they're coming from in relation to that. But it is something that we all need to be aware of at the moment. So thanks, Derek. Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much.